In 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed and focused on women's suffrage. This association was built from two women's suffrage groups and formed the name NAWSA. The main focus was to get women's rights to vote nationwide. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first president of the NAWSA. She was also known as a leading figure of the early women's rights movement. In 1982, Susan B. Anthony became president of the NAWSA after Stanton. She fought for women's rights to vote and stopped at nothing. From her efforts, she was the first woman to be pictured on a U.S. coin. The next president of the NAWSA was Carrie Chapman Catt. She agreed that the nation could no longer deny the right for women to vote who were supporting the war efforts by selling war bonds and organizing benefits. In 1918, the 19th Amendment was established and it gave women full voting rights.
Growing up, Rosa lived with racism in the South. She was scared of the members of the KKK who had burned down black schoolhouses and churches. She also saw black men get beaten up by a white bus driver for getting in his way. Rosa and her husband Raymond joined the National Association of the Achievement of Colored People. Rosa saw the opportunity to do something with the Freedom Train ride in Montgomery. The train was supposed to not be segregated according to the Supreme Court. Rosa led a group of African American students to the train. They attended the exposition on the train at the same time and in the same line as white students. Some people in Montgomery didn't like this, but Rosa wanted to show them that the people could be treated the same. It was on December 1st, 1955 that Rosa made her famous stand on the bus. Rosa had settled in her seat on the bus. All the seats on the bus had filled up with white men boarded. The bus driver told Rosa and some African Americans to stand up. Rosa refused. The bus driver said he would call the police. Rosa didn't move. Soon the police showed up and Rosa was arrested. Rosa was charged with breaking the segregation law and was told to pay a fine of $10. She refused to pay, however, saying that she was not guilty and that the law was illegal. She appealed to higher court. That night, a number of African American leaders got together and decided to boycott the city buses. This meant that African Americans would no longer ride the buses. One of these leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., had become the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association and helped lead the boycotts.
After Rosa Parks was arrested, her church members issued a notice to other African Americans saying that if Negroes did not ride the bus, they could not operate. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses for protest of the trial. This soon was called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This went on for 13 months. Leaders involved, like Martin Luther King Jr., received death threats, bombings, jailings, but it turned out that because of the whites reacting this way, the whole boycott caught the media's attention nationwide. The Montgomery bus segregation law was found unconstitutional, so African Americans boarded back on the buses and sat wherever they pleased. On the night of the start of the boycott, a 26-year-old Baptist minister from Atlanta named Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to the NAACP about continuing the boycott. From this movement on, they decided to continue the boycott. Dr. King became the spokesperson for the movement. The boycott also made Dr. King known as the best civil rights leader in the nation. He believed that only love could convert people to the side of justice. Dr. King described the power of nonviolent opposers. We will wear you down by our capacity to suffer, and in winning our freedom, we will win you on the process.
For a number of years, the Negro passengers on the city bus lines of Montgomery have been humiliated, intimidated, and faced threats on this bus line. Just the other day, one of the fine citizens of our community, Mrs. Rosa Parks, was arrested because she refused to give up her seat for a white passenger.
The FCLC is an African American civil rights organization founded after the Montgomery bus boycott.
As civil rights movement spread south, the Montgomery Improvement Association of the South met in Atlanta on January 10 and 11, 1957, to form a regional organization and arrange protest activities across the southern part of the United States.
Not knowing that the home and church of Ralph David Abernathy during the Atlanta meeting would get bombed, 60 persons from 10 different states got together and announced the founding of the Southern Leadership Conference of Transportation and Nonviolent Integration. A month later, the organization shortened its name to the Southern Leadership Conference. They established an executive board of directors and elected officers, having Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as its president.
One of the high schools that blacks were not allowed to attend was Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The leader of the NAACP was a lady named Daisy Bates. Daisy recruited the 9 African American students to enroll in Central High. When the Little Rock 9 went to attend the first day of school on September 4, 1957, they arrived with people yelling at them. They told them to go away and they didn't want them there. The National Guard soldiers walked their way into the school. The governor of Arkansas helped deploy the soldiers to prevent the students from going to school in the Supreme Court. After the Arkansas governor got involved in stopping Little Rock 9 from attending school, the president took action. He sent the USA Army to Little Rock 9 to protect the students. A few weeks later, the students attended school surrounded by Army soldiers. After the first year in 1958, the Arkansas governor closed all public schools in Little Rock. He decided that it was better to have no school at all than to have integrated schools. The schools remained closed for the entire school year. When the schools reopened the following year, many people blamed Little Rock 9 for causing them to miss a school year. The racial tension got worse and worse during the years. The results of Little Rock 9 were not positive, but it did help desegregation in public schools and take a huge step forward in the South. Their bravery gave the students the courage to press forward, and they came in the following years. Sit-in is a protest in which people sit in place and refuse to move until their demands are met. The students sat down at lunch counters and ordered coffee. The waitresses refused to serve them because they were African American. The first students stayed for 45 minutes. They came back each day with more protesters. By Thursday, there were more than 100 protesters, including whites. The SNCC formed in 1960. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was created to give young people a larger role in the civil rights movement. In 1964, they organized a voter registration drive for Southern blacks. This program was called Freedom Summer. Freedom rides were protests against segregation and interstate buses in the South. During the rides, whites would sit in the back of the bus. African Americans would sit in the front and refuse to move. At bus terminals along the route, riders would use the white-only facilities. In Alabama, segregation to slavery attacked the Freedom Riders. Despite the attacks, the riders would not give up. Kennedy sent a group of federal marshals to protect the riders. 4 months later, the federal government issued an order to integrate interstate buses facilities. The riders had achieved their goal. John F. Kennedy was a senator in Massachusetts. He was nominated for president. Late during the campaign, police arrested Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy, the candidate's brother, was called by him to arrange kids' release. These actions increased African American support for Kennedy. In May 1961, the Congressional Equality Plan Freedom Rides desegregated interstate buses or buses that travel between states.
On August 28, 1963, the March on Washington March occurred. Around 250,000 people demonstrated in this march. The march was in support of passages of new laws that protect civil rights people. The march ended at Lincoln's Memorial. The most important thing that came out of this demonstration was Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream speech. The famous words he spoke was,
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
On February 4th, 1921, Betty Friedan was born. Without her help, most women wouldn't be able to do the things they do in present day. With the amount of limited rights women had, facing discrimination in male-dominated business, and their underestimation in all these things, Betty Friedan, an American writer, activist, and feminist, wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. She described it all the problems women were facing. In all these words, The Feminine Mystique helped spark the movement for women's liberation.
Has made us feel it's unfeminine to use our rights, to really want equality, to want to take part in the decisions of the world, in politics. Career woman almost became a dirty word.
Later on, Betty Friedan became NOW's first president. Ironically, Betty Friedan died on the day of her 87th birthday. NOW was founded on June 30th, 1966, in Washington, D.C., by 28 people with the help of Friedan, a national organization for women, with its goals to help women get good jobs and equal pay as men, was born.
The Equal Rights Amendment was a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution stating that civil rights may not be denied on the basis of one's sex.
The time has come to confront, with concrete action, the conditions that now prevent women from enjoying the quality of opportunity and freedom of choice, which is their right, as individual Americans and as human beings. To take action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, exercising all privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. After Kennedy's death, Lyndon Johnson took over and continues Kennedy's promise. Shortly after this, in July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. This law abandoned segregation in public places like hotels, restaurants, and theaters. It also created the Equal Employee Opportunity Commission to help prevent discrimination. Overall, this made segregation officially illegal throughout the United States. Griswold v. Connecticut was a Supreme Court in 1965, which a law that prohibits any person from using any drug, medicinal article, or instrument for the purpose of preventing conception was placed. This led to a huge debate that we still see in modern-day society whether or not abortion should be legal. Freedom Summer, also known as the Mississippi Summer Project, a project launched in the summer of 1964 that made an attempt to register as many African American voters as possible in Mississippi. Most blacks were excluded from voting, setting up numbers of freedom schools, freedom houses, and community centers in smaller towns throughout the Mississippi to help the local black population. Northern college students volunteered their time to work with the SNCC, enduring bombing, murders, and other inhuman attacks towards blacks while performing their work. They managed to add up about 12,000 African Americans to voter registration rolls. Lyndon Johnson took office after Kennedy's assassination as the 36th President of the United States. He also had a major involvement in the Vietnam War. After Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson had a lot of pressure on him to keep supporting the civil rights movement, Voting Rights Act. President Johnson did not tolerate any more violence. On August 6, 1965, he signed the Voting Rights Act into law, banning literacy tests and other acts that kept African Americans from voting and increased voting blacks in Selma up to 50%. Finally, an official law was passed that prohibited any type of voting discrimination. During the 1960s, MLK had gone to the South to help protest with other civil rights supporters. In the protest in Birmingham, MLK was arrested and put into jail. He also led the March on Washington in 1963. This march gained President Kennedy's promise of support. This march was also when MLK gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Then in 1965, MLK and SCLC organization vote registration drives in Alabama. Also in 1966, MLK joined the protests going on in Chicago, which went on and led to riots nationwide. On April 4th, 1968, MLK was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. As a result, many people mourned his death, and upset African Americans exploded in anger. Elijah Muhammad, also known as Malcolm X, was the leader of Nation of Islam. It was a branch of Islam founded in the United States which urged blacks and whites to separate. In the mid-1960s, he left the group because he didn't support this idea. He had this idea of living in a world with all different races, but it didn't last long because in 1965, he was gunned down by the Nation of Islam.
The Pregnancy Discrimination Act is a United States federal statute. It amended Title VII of the Civil Rights of 1964 that prohibited sex discrimination on the basis of pregnancy. The act covers discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions.
Sandra O'Connor
became the first woman to serve as a justice on the United States Supreme Court in 1981. She had a reputation for being firm, but Professor Stephen Green described Justice O'Connor this way.